Israel, it's a land with so many names. Canaan, Judah, Judea, Palestine. People have lived there for virtually thousands of years. Different people from all walks of life. They were trading, traveling, they were developing their own religions, identities and cultures. You've got the Canaanites, Israelites, Philistines, and more recently the Persians, Greeks, Romans and the Ottomans. All of them left their mark on this land that we call either Israel or Palestine today, depending where you're standing. Now, we all know this land has deep historical and religious significance. So you might think that that's the reason why this area is in trouble. Actually, that's only partially true. The real trouble started, at least for the Palestinians, with the introduction of a foreign element, Zionism. And the one leading this Zionist entity right now is Benjamin Netanyahu, the same guy Lex recently interviewed. The interview reminded me of Oliver Stone's talk with President Putin. But I'm not comparing Netanyahu with Putin or Lex with Oliver Stone. What I mean is, it's an opportunity to see behind the facade of a controversial politician. At the time when thousands of people are demonstrating against him and his government. Netanyahu trying to shift power away from the judiciary system is clearly not sitting well with everyone. So big kudos to Lex and his team for securing this opportunity. The timing's perfect too, considering all the stuff that's happening in the background. We just had the 75th anniversary of the State of Israel, which for the Palestinians, it's of course the Nakba, the great catastrophe. And then there's Netanyahu's new ultra-right-wing government, which has led to a dramatic increase in violence from Israel's settler militias against the Palestinian population. Yeah, and let's not forget, Netanyahu himself is facing several corruption charges. Some think it's at least part of the reason why he's pushing for this judiciary reform. What's not making much news these days is Iran's advancing enrichment program. And as if all of this wouldn't be enough, there's even talk of a looming third intifada. So you'd think, with all of this going on, Lex, being the experienced interviewer that he is, would have some really interesting questions for Netanyahu. That's why I wanted to take a closer look at this interview. I'm interested because I'm a behavior analyst. I've done my own academic research into deception in high-stakes business negotiations. But no worries, I keep it easily digestible. I'm not going into deep theory here. And to make it even more interesting, I have included some historical nuggets coming from my own interviews with Noam Chomsky, Gideon Levy, Benny Morris and some others. You can find those interviews on my channel if you're interested. One last thing, I try to stick to facts and science. I keep emotions and opinions out. Okay, but now let's have a look at this segment that Lex has chosen as a preface for his interview with Benjamin Netanyahu.
We should never, and I never, sit aside and say, oh, they're just threatening to destroy us. They won't do it. If somebody threatens to eliminate you, as Iran is doing today, and as Hitler did then, and people discounted it, well, if somebody threatens to annihilate us, take them seriously and act to prevent it early on. Don't let them have the means to do so, because that may be too late.
Okay, so that's the very first segment that viewers get presented even before the actual intro. The aim of this segment is, of course, to capture the attention of the audience so that they don't click away in the first couple of seconds. But the choice of the content of this very first segment can also tell us something. It can tell us something about the intended audience, and it can tell us something about the framing of the interview. Framing is important. In this case, Lex, or probably more likely his producers, have chosen to frame this conversation from the outset as Israel being the victim. That's a sneaky way, again talking about framing, that's a sneaky way to influence how folks will interpret and react to the information later on in the interview. Framing, that's a well-researched methodology when we talk about manipulation. And it's also not just about the words. It's much more about the emotions these words stir up and how they shape what people think and feel about the topic. Comparing Iran with Hitler, it's a classic example, It's an evocation of the notion of Israel's perpetual existential threat. And it's directly at the very beginning. It shows us in which direction this interview will go. Okay, and now let's listen to the very first segment that I have chosen to look at.
In fact, I think you may be one of the most hated men in the world.
Lex starts with shooting sharp. And Netanyahu responds with,
I disagree with the premise of your question. I think I've enjoyed a very broad support around the world. There are certain corners in which we have this animosity that you describe, and it sort of permeates in some of the newspapers and news organs and so on in the United States.
okay, we can't really be surprised if Netanyahu disagrees with the premise, how he phrases this, with the premise of your question. And equally not surprising is that Netanyahu overemphasizes the broad support that he thinks he receives around the world, and at the same time he is minimizing the animosity to certain corners, right? That's minimizing. But minimizing critics and the arguments is a strategy that Netanyahu actually applies quite often in this interview, as you will see. The next part that stood out to me was at the end of this segment, where Netanyahu talks about peace with the Arabs, I think it was.
And the most important thing that goes against what you said is the respect that we receive from the Arab world, and the fact that we've made 4 historic peace agreements with Arab countries. They made it with me. They didn't make it with anyone else. And I respect them and they respect me.
Yep, that's another strategy that Netanyahu applies quite often in this interview. He attempts to connect his personal fate with the fate of Israel. Yeah? And it's very clear when he says, they made it with me. Yeah? They didn't make it with anyone else, and they respect me. So again, these two things where Netanyahu connects his personal fate to the fate of Israel, and this evocation of the existential or the perpetual existential threat that Israel is under, is a theme that's coming back and back again. One thing, of course, that Netanyahu leaves out here is the fact that others before him have made historic peace agreements with Arab countries. So it's not about they made it with me. And at least one of them has paid with his life for it. Okay, but Lex doesn't buy it, and he pokes a little bit further.
But there is people who don't have good things to say about Israel, who do have hate in their heart for Israel.
Yeah.
But Netanyahu is not having any of it.
Well, I think they don't know very much. I think they're guided by a lot of ignorance. They don't know about Israel.
Okay, so what happens here is, I don't know if you want to call it a full frontal attack or defense, right? But basically what Netanyahu is doing here is calling Israel's critics stupid, ignorant, also something that we will see again and again in this interview.
They don't know that Israel is a stellar democracy.
Well, there's some debate about Israel's democracy, especially right now with all the demonstrations that are going on. But besides the current demonstrations, how can you call a country a democracy or even a stellar democracy, yeah, if large parts of the population are excluded from it, actually at gunpoint?
But changing the world for the better.
Is Israel really changing the world for the better? Well, let's come back to this in a moment.
And spreading this among 6 continents. We've sent rescue teams more than any other country in the world, and we're 1/10 of 1% of the world's population. But when there's an earthquake or a devastation in Haiti or in the Philippines, Israel is there. When there's an earthquake, a devastating earthquake in Turkey, Israel was there. When there's something in Nepal, Israel is there. And it's the second country. It's the second country after, in one case, India, or after, in another case, the United States.
So what Netanyahu is doing here, he's cultivating the image of Israel as benefactor of the whole world. We call this, in behavior analysis, we call this impression management. But he is right. Israel is sending rescue teams into earthquakes.
Israel is there. Tiny Israel is a benefactor to all of humanity.
That's an interesting one. Tiny Israel is a benefactor. Did you hear how he emphasized it? To all of humanity. Well, tiny is relative when we speak about Israel. It's true that Israel is tiny in geographical terms. Yeah, landmass is not very large. But Israel is certainly not tiny in military or economic terms, and certainly not from a cyber perspective. But Netanyahu is right when he says that Israel is a technologically advanced society. There's absolutely no debate about that. But is Israel really such a benefactor to all of humanity, as Netanyahu stresses? There's a brand new book called The Palestine Laboratory. I just finished reading it. In the book, Anthony Löwenstein points out that Israel has a consistent track record of supporting the most brutal regimes on the planet. Again, I'm not trying to bash Israel, right? But I stick with facts and science. That's what I do. So just to give you an idea of what really happens in the background. Israel supported Myanmar. I don't know, if you're my age, you may remember it as Burma, right? So Israel supported Myanmar as recently as 2018 in what the UN called genocide against the Muslim Rohingya minority. Myanmar's army used arson, rape and murder, and this is all documented by the UN as weapons against the civilian population. Israel sold fighter jets and trained the Sri Lankan special forces while they killed more than 200,000 people from the Tamil minority. Again, civilian population. Rwanda. Remember Rwanda? More than 1 million Tutsis were massacred by the Hutus. Israel continued to send weapons even after the 6th of April 1994. That's when the slaughter actually started. Same in Guatemala, 200,000 dead. Does the name Somoza still ring a bell? Somoza, Nicaragua, brutal regime. He killed tens of thousands of Nicaraguans with Israeli weapons. Now I want to point out it's not only Israeli weapons, right? The US had their fingers deep in that story too. Nelson Mandela was very clear-eyed when it came to Israel. He said at an international congress that the people of South Africa will never forget the support of the State of Israel to the apartheid regime, not surprisingly. Again, Israel was not the only supporter of the apartheid regime, I know that, but we talk about Israel here. So don't get me wrong, yes, Israel sends rescue teams when disaster strikes. But what happens in the background, does it really match with Netanyahu's image of tiny Israel as a benefactor to all of humanity? And obviously, Netanyahu does not include the Palestinians in his all of humanity. Dehumanizing enemies is a manipulation technique. You must first dehumanize your enemies in order to bring your own population to do what's needed or to do what the regime wants to do with the enemies. In the case of Israel, of course, it's the brutal repression of the Palestinians. I think that's the first of a number of opportunities that Lex missed to ask some more probing questions.
If you look at World War II, what do you learn from human nature, from the rise of the Third Reich and the rise of somebody like Hitler and the hate that permeates that?
So Lex is again underscoring that the Jews were the victims. That goes back to the initial, the initial segment from the very beginning. But he's right. At the time, of course, the Jews were the victims. But then we get to really interesting comments from Netanyahu.
Well, what I've learned is that you have to nip bad things in the bud. You have to, there's a Latin term that says, obsta principi, stop bad things when they're small.
That was the first one, but I want to make a separation between the two of them because they're slightly different.
And the deliberate hatred, the incitement of hatred against one community, its demonization, delegitimization that goes with it, is a very dangerous thing.
I think every single Palestinian would agree with both statements. It seems to me that Netanyahu was blissfully unaware of the irony of what he was saying. Imagine, and the deliberate hatred, the incitement of hatred against one community, its demonization, delegitimization that goes on with it is a very dangerous thing. Exactly. So again, I don't think that Netanyahu realized what he was saying here. And unfortunately, neither did Lex.
They won't do it. If somebody threatens to eliminate you, as Iran is doing today, and as Hitler did then, and people discounted it, well...
Okay, so that's another example when Netanyahu underlines the existential threat against Israel. And he does so by equating Iran with Hitler. The notion of the existential threat against Israel is something that the Zionist project needs in order to maintain itself. The next question from Lex is a really good one. I'm just not sure if Lex realizes how sensitive this is. Let's see how Lex responds to Netanyahu's response. First, the question.
How much of it is anti-Zionism and how much of it is anti-Semitism?
And here comes Netanyahu.
I don't distinguish between the two. You can't say, well, I'm okay with Jews, but I just don't think there should be a Jewish state. It's like saying, I'm not anti-American, I just don't think there should be an America. That's basically what people are saying vis-a-vis anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. When you're saying anti-Zionism, you're saying that Jewish people don't have a right to have a state of their own. And that is a denial of a basic principle that I think completely unmasks what is involved here. Today, anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism. Those who oppose the Jewish people oppose the Jewish state.
Okay, so the primary statement here is that Netanyahu does not distinguish between the two, meaning between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. He says anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism, and those who oppose Jewish people oppose the Jewish state. Okay, so do you agree? Anti-Zionism is the same as anti-Semitism. If I criticize Israel, I must hate Jews? Is that really how we see things? The point that Netanyahu tries to make here is contested, not because there's any ambiguity if he's right or wrong. It's because he is so wrong. Because anti-Zionism is definitely not the same as anti-Semitism. If you have seen any of my interviews with Noam Chomsky, Gideon Levy, or even Benny Morris, you will understand why. Anti-Semitism, this term refers to prejudice, hatred, or discrimination against Jewish people because they're Jewish people, because of their ethnicity or religion. But anti-Zionism, this is a political position that criticizes the state of Israel or what Israel does to the Palestinians. Netanyahu, of course, knows that, and he uses this argument of not differentiating between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism for a very specific purpose. He's deliberately trying to convince us to accept that those two concepts are equal, because then he can delegitimize any criticism of Israel's actions. By labeling all criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic, he wants to discredit anyone who dares to speak out and to shield Israel from any scrutiny. And he has success with this strategy, especially in Europe, most of all in Germany. If we think this to its logical conclusion, if what Netanyahu said is true, then all the protesters would be anti-Semitic because they protest against him and his government. Again, that's a key point with vast ramifications, because with this line of argumentation you can stifle any criticism towards Israel, which of course is exactly what Netanyahu wants. Usually when people accept this argument, it's an indication that they either don't understand the concepts of anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism, or that they have an agenda. Now, Lex is a smart guy, so I really don't know why he's letting Netanyahu get away completely unchallenged with a factual, incorrect and misleading statement such as this one.
If we jump from human history to the current particular moment, there's protests in Israel now about the proposed judicial reform that gives power to your government to override the Supreme Court. So the critics say that this gives too much power to you, virtually making you a dictator.
Okay, let's forgive Lex that he didn't question Netanyahu more on the previous topic. Instead, he jumps to the next one. But it's again a really good question, because it goes to the core of the mass demonstrations that are going on right now. And no matter how dismissive Netanyahu is about the demonstrations, I think it's really safe to assume that he feels the pressure. Pressure from all directions, inclusive his own right-wing coalition government, and that he will try to dismiss any suggestions of him becoming a dictator.
Yeah, well, that's ridiculous. The mere fact that you have so many demonstrations and protests, some dictatorship, huh? There's a lot of democracy here, more rambunctious and more robust than just anywhere on the planet.
So let's have a closer look at this one. Lex talks about the proposed judiciary reform, right? It's about the future. It's not there yet. It's only proposed. And how does Netanyahu respond? So he talks about the present, right? Because the demonstrations are happening right now. That's a similar technique as Bill Clinton used during an interview with Jim Lehrer from PBS about the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Clinton answered the question if he had an affair with Monica with, "There is no relationship with that woman."
You had no sexual relationship with this young woman.
There is not a sexual relationship. That is accurate.
Did you catch it? The interviewer didn't He and the rest of America took it as there never was a relationship with Monica. Technically, Clinton spoke the truth because at the time of the interview his relation with Monica was already over. But with answering a question related to past events, with the present, Clinton deceived a whole nation, undetected. As you have seen, Netanyahu also plays with the tenses here because Lex refers to the future, when the judiciary reform would make Netanyahu a dictator, and Netanyahu answers with the present, that Israel is a democracy because all these people can still protest. But that of course might change if the reform goes through.
Can you steel man the case that this may give too much power to the coalition government, to the prime minister, not just to you, but to those who follow?
So again, if you look closer at the formulation of the question, then you see that the question is already much softer. Why? First of all, it's the order. There comes the coalition government, then comes the prime minister, and then those who follow. So it's sandwiched. We call this the shit sandwich. And then the prime minister, it's no longer Netanyahu, it's the third person. So there's a distance. So overall, the question is packaged differently and much easier for Netanyahu to answer.
No, I think that's complete hogwash, because I think there's a very few people who are demonstrating against this, quite a few.
So Netanyahu doesn't accept it at all. It's complete hogwash. And then he minimizes the protests against him. He minimizes it to very few people. Quite a few, he even repeats it. If you're listening what he's saying and you're looking at these pictures, you might get the feeling that Netanyahu is losing the grip on reality.
Well, quite many don't have an idea what is being discussed.
Quite many don't have an idea what's being discussed. Basically, what Netanyahu is doing here is he's calling his people stupid again. I think he might be surprised how well informed Israelis really are, at least when it comes to that topic.
They're basically being sloganized. You can sloganize, you know something about, not mass media right now, but the social network. You can basically feed deliberately with big data and big money. You can just feed slogans and get into people's minds.
There's this interesting detail that Netanyahu makes a distinction here between the mass media right now, and the social networks. I'm not entirely sure what's behind this, because in other places Netanyahu is quite critical of the mass media. Again, this is just a little detail, but Netanyahu is absolutely right. It's very easy to manipulate people, and I'm saying this as a behavior analyst. Yeah? I know a thing or two about cognitive biases and the psychological mechanisms of stereotypes, basically shortcuts in our brain, right? You can manipulate them and feed them with slogans. And when Netanyahu talks about slogans, he's right, because Israel has some of the best slogans. There's the slogan from the most moral army in the world. And then you have the slogan of a land without people, for people without land. They are so ingrained in people's minds that no matter what facts you present to the contrary, they're outright rejected. But as a behavior analyst, of course, I know facts don't change minds, emotions do. And then Netanyahu keeps speaking for almost 5 minutes. That's too much, but I picked two specific statements related to this contested judiciary reform.
Was encapsulated by the founding fathers of the United States. You create a balance between the three branches of government, okay? The legislative, the executive, and the judiciary.
Okay, that was the first one, but another one is related to it. That's this one.
Bringing it back into line, into what is common in all parliamentary democracies and in the United States.
So he's bringing in the United States twice. So it's clear to which audience Netanyahu is directing himself. But what he's trying here, he's attempting to convince us that what he plans to implement is basically what's done in the US today. But that's factually incorrect. In fact, it's so false that I'm inclined to call this a deception. And of course, Netanyahu knows it, because there are fundamental differences between the judiciary in the US and Israel, especially when it comes to the number of checks and balances in both countries. If you want to know more about these differences, there is a recent interview from this very Lex Fridman with Yuval Noah Harari, where he eloquently explains them. Netanyahu then goes on to defend his contested reforms for quite a bit unchallenged. This would have been another occasion where I really would have wished for Lex to be a bit more inquisitive. And then the topic goes completely in a different direction. So from about almost 14 minutes into the interview, for the next 13 minutes, it's about AI, tech companies, and cybersecurity. Now, AI and cybersecurity are definitely interesting when it comes to Israel. However, I will skip this part because, unfortunately, there was not a single word about the fact that Israel uses AI to increase its repression of the Palestinian population. No discussion about the installation of autonomous weapons system at checkpoints. No discussion about the collection of biometric and other data from all Palestinians to feed Israel's insatiable AI algorithms. Not a word about the automated apartheid report from Amnesty International. Not a single word about the Blue Wolf, the Red Wolf, or the Wolf Pack AI programs. All this information is freely available if you're interested. What I don't understand from Lex is that it doesn't jump on this topic. I mean, it's completely up his alley. There would also have been an opportunity to question Netanyahu about the so-called battle-tested drones and AI systems for population control that flood the global markets. If you think that's only relevant for Israel, wait and see. I mean, populism is growing. Instead, Netanyahu was happy to discuss martial arts, but that's again a part that I will skip. Where it gets interesting again is when Lex asks Netanyahu about the corrupting nature of power. It's interesting because Netanyahu spends 3.5 minutes denying that he has any.
Do you worry about the corrupting nature of power on you as a leader, on you as a man?
Not at all, because I think that the thing that drives me is nothing but the mission that I took to assure the survival and thriving of the state, the Jewish state. That is, its economic prosperity, but its security and its ability to achieve peace with our neighbors.
So first, Netanyahu makes sure that we don't forget that Israel is under a perpetual existential threat, right? Survival of the Jewish state. And then I wonder, Netanyahu, who took the absolutely last option to him to stay in power, by forming a coalition government with convicted Israeli extremists. I don't want to say terrorists. He says that what drives him is his mission and not a thirst for power. And then he goes on to deny 8 times that he has any power before he stops speaking 3.5 minutes later. From a linguistic and credibility analysis perspective, that's really interesting because the fact that Netanyahu feels the need to make 8 individual denials indicates that this is a very sensitive topic to him. And if we look closely, we notice that at the beginning the denials are minimal, like no power statements. But then as he keeps talking, they evolve into more elaborate, full sentences of denials. So here we have the no power, nothing. And then it gets more elaborate, not because I must a great political power. Not only do I have none that I control, it goes further in the next paragraph, and so the idea that I'm an omnipotent authoritarian dictator is ridiculous. I don't believe in this thing of amassing the corrupting power. I would say the concentration of power lies elsewhere, not here. I don't want to overanalyze this, but it's clear that Netanyahu's desire to deny that he has any power increases the more he does so. We also see that he continuously paints himself as the victim while denying that he has any power. There were some things. They are all against me here. Often vilified me. With a disadvantage that the major media outlets are very violent sometimes against me. Remember what I said a while back, that he made a distinction between the major media outlets and the social media. So I was surprised because it sounded almost a little bit like he's defending the mainstream media. But here again, he's the victim of the mainstream media. Power and corruption are two sides of the same coin, and Lex makes a fluid transition from one to the other with this next question.
Well, you have been involved in several corruption cases. How much corruption is there in Israel? And how do you fight it in your own party and in Israel?
From a linguistic perspective, it's really interesting to see how Lex structures this question. In the first sentence, Lex seems to ask Netanyahu about his own corruption. But in fact, it's not a question, it's a statement of well-known facts. You have been involved in several corruption cases. Again, it's a statement, not a question. Lex then switches directly from Netanyahu's corruption to corruption in Israel and in Netanyahu's party. Strictly speaking, these are two separate topics. And as an interviewer, Lex should know better. Compound question. Again, if we take the first part here as a question, which I assume it's supposed to be, compound question, meaning asking more than one question, is always a tricky issue, because usually the addressee of these compound questions, they always pick the easier question and neglect the more difficult one. It also shows me in the way this question is structured that Lex is mindful not to antagonize Netanyahu, or that Lex is not prepared to go all the way, because how he puts this question offers Netanyahu an easy way out. So what Lex is doing here is he's putting his finger in Netanyahu's wound, or in one of Netanyahu's wounds, but he makes sure it's not too hurtful by offering an immediate deflection. A deflection away from Netanyahu and onto Israel and Netanyahu's party. To his credit, Netanyahu doesn't take the easy way out. He doesn't use the deflection that Lex has offered. Instead, he uses his own deflection.
Well, you should ask a different question.
That's a classic case of dodging a question in plain sight. And he does so in a way that still makes him appear cooperative. But clearly Netanyahu is not answering the question about corruption. Instead, he spends the next 3 minutes trying to convince us that the charges are unjustified. But if you pay attention, you will notice that he does so without mentioning a single relevant or verifiable fact that's actually related to the charges. Instead, he goes on the offense by painting himself as the victim again.
No politician has been more vilified. None has been put to such a, what is it? About $250 million shekels were used to scrutinize me, scour my bank accounts, sending people to the Philippines, into Mexico, into Europe, into America.
Here, when Netanyahu talks in superlatives, no politician has been more vilified. He sounds like Trump. But look at the relevance. How relevant are the things that he's listing here in regards to his corruption charges? He only talks about the things that happened to him, not a single word about what he did. Why was he charged with corruption? So ask yourself, is he really answering the question, or he's trying to convince us of his innocence? But as you can see in my color coding here, there's something else interesting going on. In this paragraph, we see 6 times the phrase, you know. You know, you know, you know, you know, you know, you know, you know. It goes even further, you know. And I think up there we had it also, you know, you know, you know. For a linguist, you knows are red flags. At least in the context of credibility analysis, because this phrase is not only used to seek validation from the listener. There's much more to it. You knows can help to build trust in deceptive statements. It can mask uncertainty, because it gives the impression that the information that's being presented is common knowledge and is therefore less likely to be questioned. But most and foremost, and I have to be specific here, in the context of credibility analysis, it's an evasion tactic. When faced with challenging questions or uncomfortable truth, a deceptive speaker may employ as a way to avoid giving direct answers and to maintain a semblance of honesty, which is something that Netanyahu absolutely has to do. There's only one other paragraph in this whole interview where Netanyahu used as many I think it was 5. And that was when he was talking about him not having any power. So look at the topics that are being discussed. So this here was about him not having any power, right? Not having power. Is he going up here? No, not yet. So him not having power, you know. And then corruption, even more, you knows. Again, there are no topics in this whole interview where Netanyahu falls back on this kind of linguistic patterns. Okay, and I have another linguistic example that's really interesting. So what we can see here is...
Stuff comes out. People are not saying, what did Netanyahu do? Because he apparently did nothing. What was done to him is something that people ask. What was done to him? What was done to our democracy? What was done in the attempt to put down somebody who keeps winning elections despite the handicaps that I described? Maybe we can nail him by framing him. And the one thing I can say about this court trial is that things are coming out, and that's very good. Just objective things are coming out, changing the picture. So I would say the attempt to brand me as corrupt is falling on its face, but the thing that is being uncovered in the trial, such as the use of spyware on a politician's surroundings to try to shake them down in investigations.
So again, there are a couple of interesting things here. The first that I would like to point out is that he switches between the first person and the third person. What did Netanyahu do? Because he apparently did nothing. What was done to him? What was done to him? Incidentally, he connects again. What was done to him? What was done to our democracy? Again, he connects his personal fate to the fate of Israel or its democracy. Somebody, third person, nailing him by framing him on a politician, third person, right? He uses the third person when talking about the corruption charges coming from the outside. It's a means of distancing himself. And then he switches to the first person when he describes the actions he has taken to defend himself. So there's a clear flip-flop between third person, distancing, and first person. In linguistics, we call this distancing. It's a tactic that can be used to create linguistic but also psychological distance between a person and events. And then there is, of course, the statement about the use of spyware.
The use of spyware on a politician's.
So the use of spyware on a politician. Am I the only one who is not missing the irony of what he's saying here? The use of spyware was institutionalized by Israel. Remember Pegasus? It's an Israeli spyware coming from the NSO group. It spied virtually on all of Europe's politicians. And we know that because they were found out. But of course it's different when you have to swallow your own medicine, as Netanyahu apparently had to do here.
This kind of technology is regarded as a weapon. You can't just sell it from Israel around the world. You need approval from the Israeli government, from the foreign ministry, and from the defense ministry.
And finally, after 40 or so minutes, Lex is asking about the Palestinians. The order of things can tell us something. It can tell us something about priority.
What is the top obstacle to peaceful coexistence of Israelis and Palestinians? Let's talk about the big question of peace in this part of the world.
And Netanyahu responds with from a linguistic perspective, quite interesting statement, especially considering that he sees himself as a reader of history.
Well, I think the reason you have the persistence of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which goes back about a century, is the persistent Palestinian refusal to recognize a Jewish state, a nation state for the Jewish people in any boundary. That's why they opposed the establishment of the state of Israel before we had a state, and that's why they've opposed it after we had a state. They opposed it when we didn't have Judea and Samaria, the West Bank in our heads, and Gaza, and they oppose it after we have it. Doesn't make a difference. It's basically their persistent refusal to recognize a Jewish state in any boundaries. And I think their tragedy is that they've been commandeered for a century by leadership that refused to compromise with the idea of Zionism, namely that the Jews deserve a state in this part of the world. The territorial dispute is something else. You have a territorial dispute if you say, okay, you're living on this side, we're living on that side, let's decide where the border is, and so on. That's not what the argument is.
So apparently Netanyahu's worldview is pretty black and white. It's the Palestinians' fault. The Palestinian refusal. Their tragedy. They have been commandeered. So it's an incredibly one-sided argument. And apparently Netanyahu does make a difference between Zionism and Semitism. At least there where it suits him.
So even as part of a two-state solution, they're still against the idea.
There's more to be said about the two-state solution, but Lex goes in the same direction as Netanyahu because he says they are still against the idea. Yes, it's they, the Palestinians, who Lex is referring to. And here, I'm afraid to say, is the part where Lex's lack of historical knowledge shows a bit. The two-state solution was never accepted by Israel. Already the founder of Israel, Ben-Gurion, wrote in a letter to his brother that he accepted the UN proposed partition of Palestine, meaning the two-state solution, only as a means to achieve statehood. Once that was done, he wanted to expand Israel from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River. Menachem Begin, notably a Nobel Prize laureate, told a cheering crowd in New York that Israel will continue until the whole of Israel is liberated from the Arabs. The CIA had no illusions too. They wrote in a report that Israel's boundaries are regarded as only a beachhead from where to expand. And if you have any doubts, just listen to Israel's current finance minister Smotrich. He's one of those extremists in the coalition government. He wants to win, as he says, to win the Israel-Palestine conflict by flooding the occupied territories with another 500,000 more settlers. And that's something he openly stated in what he calls his decisive plan. If you need further information that Israel always wanted to expand even over the Jordan River, watch my interviews with Noam Chomsky, Gideon Levy, Benny Morris, and some others. Noam specifically told me that Israel will never accept an Arab state within its borders, within what it considers its borders. And I have said this on another occasion, but there are similarities between the two-state solution and the Minsk agreements. Remember the Minsk agreements? Both of them, Ukraine-Russia war, remember? That was nothing more than a trick to gain time. In the case of the Minsk agreements, we know that because the French President Hollande and the German Chancellor Merkel confirmed in a press conference that the Minsk agreements were only meant to stall for time to allow the West, that's us, to arm and train the Ukraine army to become strong enough to take on Russia. And that's going on since 2014. Okay, but back to Netanyahu and the two-state solution.
Well, they don't want a state next to Israel. They want a state instead of Israel. And they say if we get a state, we'll use it as a springboard to destroy the smaller Israeli state.
In the next 3 minutes, Netanyahu basically confirms that Israelis, except for the hard left, generally don't believe that a two-state solution will work. He insists that Israel must retain control over security, including airspace and electromagnetic space, to prevent threats to Israel's existence. Again, a reference to the perpetual existential threat of Israel. I said it already, this perpetual threat to Israel's existence is a necessity for Israel. Without it, its actions would be completely delegitimized. Netanyahu's solution is Palestinian self-governance, but without any powers that could jeopardize Israel's security, even if it means not achieving full sovereignty. I will come back to this in a moment. Lex still doesn't give up on the two-state solution.
So a two-state solution where Israel controls the security of the entire region.
But Netanyahu corrects him.
We don't call it quite that. I mean, there are different names, but the idea is, yes, Israel controls security in it's the entire area. It's this tiny area between the Jordan River and the sea. I mean,
here you can see that as Ben-Gurion and Menachem Begin before him, Netanyahu views Israel's natural boundaries as the Mediterranean Sea on one side and the Jordan River on the other. With the next question, Lex again puts his finger on a sensitive spot.
So the expansion of settlements in the West Bank has been a top priority for this new government. So many harshly criticize this as contributing to escalating the Israel-Palestine tensions.
Yeah, well,
can you understand that perspective that this expansion of settlements is not good for this two-state solution?
Let's not forget here that the settlers are armed and protected by the army.
Yeah, I can understand what they're saying, and they don't understand why they're wrong. First, most Israelis who live in Judea, Samaria, live in urban blocks, and that accounts for about 90% of the population. Okay, and everybody recognizes that those urban blocks are going to be part of Israel in any future arrangement. So they're really arguing about something that has already been decided and agreed upon, really, by Americans, even by Arabs, many Arabs.
Okay, first let's have a look at the question again. The question was, can you understand that this expansion of settlements is not good for the two-state solution? Now let's disregard for a moment that Lex is still holding on to the two-state solution despite the fact that Netanyahu already told him that nobody in Israel really wants it. But with his fixation on the two-state solution, Lex completely overlooks some crucial points that Netanyahu makes next, or at least he fails to respond to or question them in any form or shape. First, Netanyahu basically calls people who are against the expansion of the settlements, which are illegal under international law, stupid. They don't understand why they are wrong. Then he goes on with a classic avoidance strategy because 1, he does not answer the question, and 2, he shifts the topic, and Lex fell for it. Let's have a look how he did it. Again, the question was, can you understand that this expansion of settlements is not good for the two-state solution? Netanyahu responds by saying that most Israelis who live in Judea and Samaria live in urban blocks. As if Israelis living in urban blocks would take anything away from the fact that they're living in occupied territory. And then he continues with, and that accounts for about 90% of the population. Well, the question was not in what type of communities the settlers live, or how many percentage of them live there. And as if to give the settlements in Judea and Samaria, which are in the occupied West Bank, some kind of credibility, he calls them urban blocks. Linguistically, what Netanyahu does here is interesting. So the settlements are no longer settlements but urban blocks, which gives them a slightly less hostile connotation. But call them as you like, under international law they're still illegal settlements in an occupied territory. And then Netanyahu talks about the acceptance of those urban blocks by the Americans or other Arab states. That's kind of a misleading statement because, as said, these settlements are not recognized under international law. That Israel will never give them up is another story altogether. So Netanyahu skillfully avoided to answer the actual question. And he did so in plain sight while still appearing cooperative. I have seen this over and over in my research. Unfortunately, none of this was picked up by Lex. On the other hand, who can blame him? I have seen experienced negotiators falling in the exactly same trap. But Netanyahu keeps talking.
And I think there's a solution out there, but I don't think we're going to get to it, which is less than perfect sovereignty, which involves Israeli security maintained for the entire territory by Israel, which involves not rooting out anybody, not kicking out, uprooting Arabs or Palestinians. They're going to live in enclaves in sovereign Israel, and we're going to live probably in enclaves there, probably through transportational continuity as opposed to territorial continuity. That is, for example, you can have tunnels and overpasses and so on that connect the various communities. We're doing that right now. And it actually works.
Yes, Netanyahu has a solution. That's exactly the solution that Noam Chomsky was afraid would eventually materialize. That is an entrenchment and extension of the status quo, which Noam calls the third solution after the one and two-state solution. When Netanyahu talks about enclaves, overpasses and tunnels that connect the various communities, what he means is a total separation of the Palestinians from Israel and as a consequence full control over all of Palestine. He's actually saying it. We are doing it right now and it actually works. Yes, they do, and yes, it works. For Israel. Ask any Palestinian and you will hear a totally different story. Just look at these pictures and you understand why. Then you will also understand why
They don't want a solution of the kind that I described, or any kind except the one that involves the dissolution of the State of Israel.
they don't want a solution of the kind that I have described. Again, if you really understand what Netanyahu describes, then it's clear that nobody would accept such a solution. Now, the interview continues for another 20 minutes or so, but deviates away from the Israel-Palestine conflict. Overall, Lex spent less than 15 of the 70 minutes long interview on the topic of the Israel-Palestine conflict, which is, frankly, a bit disappointing given the gravity of the issue. But in all fairness, Lex is no match for sly fox like Netanyahu, who is battle-hardened in both the military and oratory sense. Netanyahu seems to have all the right answers because he has practiced them more often than any other person on this planet, and he knows exactly how to stay clear of topics that could shatter the imaginary image that he paints. Let me finish by repeating something that Netanyahu said in his interview.
The deliberate hatred, the incitement of hatred against one community, its demonization, delegitimization that goes with it, is a very dangerous thing.
Here Netanyahu is absolutely right. I hope he tells this also to his right-wing settler militias who swarm, terrorize and even kill ordinary Palestinians in their homes and villages. I think we all can appreciate that Netanyahu warns us from a religious fundamentalist Iran with a nuke. But I believe that the messianic government of Israel with a nuke is at least as dangerous. One can only hope that Netanyahu can control his messianic genie in a bottle that he has let out to stay in power. As Noam Chomsky recently told me.
But it's different now because there's a new government in Israel, which is quite different from the earlier ones. It's a government which basically says, we've got God on our side, so we don't care what you think. Well, when you have that kind of government, it becomes unpredictable. Ben Gvir, Smotrich, these guys might do whatever they feel like and blow up the world. Okay, who cares? God's on our side.
Coincidentally, Sinead O'Connor died today. So I will use her words as final conclusion. On a human level, nobody with any sanity would have anything but sympathy for the Palestinian plight. There is not a sane person on earth who in any way sanctions what the Israeli authorities are doing. Thanks for watching and sleep tight.